So we can go to the next slide. Yeah, today we'll be talking about the digital monitoring tools that we used in Ethiopia. I'll be joined by my colleague, Anna. Next slide. So we worked in Afar region of Ethiopia with another USAID project, Lowland Wash Activity, as well as in partnership with the Afar region to implement digital tools for monitoring with the goal of improving coordination and management of maintenance. So the focus was on ensuring data was available and was able to be used for operation and maintenance. We implemented a variety of tools for asset management, including a variety of surveys and updates to data, sensors, and a very comprehensive management information system. And the project began, at the beginning of SWS. Monitoring was always a part of it, but it really the focus was on throughout 2019 through recently in implementing these tools led by an embedded focal person. That was like a change to what we had done previously, where the focal person was there in the region, giving continuous capacity development. And kind of a general overview of how the tool works. You can see, 4 different items are being fed into the system: the asset surveys, updates, O&M issues, and the sensor reports. And this was supposed to put out lead to using data for day-to-day asset management, as well as more long-term use of data for planning and reporting. And here you can see sort of 2 components. The left dashboard is the dashboard where the data is visualized, as well as the app there in the middle. That's actually 2 pages. The map is the application that was used, so that's the home screen there. And then the sensors that are feeding into the system runtime data in near real time. And so overall, the AMS was a really interesting but challenging project. So we saw less uptake than we would have liked. It was not used as widely as we anticipated, and this was due to a variety of factors, particularly the complexity of the system, a lack of incentives, and a lot of changes at the region, through turnover and a variety of items like that. We saw that demand was lower than expected as well, and this is something that we really did not anticipate. Monitoring and data is always said to be very important, but we didn't see the O&M team updating the system as much as we expected, and I think they found that there was a big disconnect between their expectations for data and what the system could actually deliver, and how those things aligned with kind of their daily activities versus the long-term goals that this project had envisioned. But the use of data, one really big positive was that the region has started to restructure around data. So they've added a new department that will be solely focused on data. And I think this is something that we really learned, that the way that we see a technology kind of being used by everybody is not necessarily how technologies are used at the regional level, where somebody really needs to be in charge of managing that data, and this kind of distributed computing, or whatever you want to call it, is not really how things work. So this restructuring, we hope, will allow for sort of better management and integration into a lot of the different bureaus. Yeah, so overall, it was really complex system. It was challenged to fit into existing processes, and overall, wasn't as successful, but we learned a lot about it, and sort of what maybe a next iteration of these type of technologies might be in a similar context. Anna, I think you can go ahead.
Yeah, so I was going to present a little bit more about like the technical aspects of working with the sensor data that came in from SWS. So sensor accuracy, we're simply defining that as like the number of times the sensor accurately measured the borehole status on a day. And the way we verify the borehole status is, of course, manually checking and making phone calls and things like that. So from what we've seen of the data set, sensors provide a historical and a real-time source of information on pump usage and predicted uptimes and downtimes of these large water schemes for about half of them in the region. And that has informed water supply planning to an extent. So lower than expected accuracy was a problem. Sensors are about 82% accurate at predicting a functional working pump and 48% accurate at predicting a broken pump. So there is a lot of uncertainty about whether a pump is actually broken when a non-functional or no use sensor status comes in, which led to a lot of challenges for implementing this data for actually conducting borehole repairs. There was also a lot of equipment failures. It's new technology, and network outages also created challenges interpreting the sensor reports as they came in, despite a lot of demonstrated enthusiasm about the technology in the dashboard. An increased number of breakdowns reported from sensors did also not really increase the repair rates, just simply because the FR O&M team's budget and resources are so constrained that we found that information sharing wasn't really the problem, constraining the number of repairs they're able to undertake. They actually have, in many cases, like a backlog of repairs that they're meaning to get to, and it's more the logistics of setting up a repair team and going to undertake that repair than whether they know about what's broken where. So despite like SWS efforts at like making more funds available for repairs, that didn't really happen in time for this project. So we didn't really see an increase in functionality from sensors, and I did a small impact evaluation on that topic and found not much. And I also recommend looking more at this article in Science of the Total Environment that I linked below for all about sensor accuracy, including some machine learning algorithms that we tested to try to kind of better interpret this data and see what can we really tell from the sensor data in the region. Yeah, thanks for sharing that link, Brittany. Okay, so we also have two major learning reports that we're here to share today. Both are published kind of recently, but the one on the left is actually a mid-implementation review of the AFAR asset management systems uptake. So everything that Brett presented on in much more detail, including looking into like the user metadata and trends over time of who was using it, why, what they were doing with the system, and what impact our trainings and embedded facilitation had on use of monitoring data in AFAR. And on the right, the paper near real-time borehole functionality monitoring for strengthening water supply management. That one's really much more about the sensors and goes into their accuracy, their deployment, their reliability, and how the data has been used and applied. So both of these are really good, in-depth reads. But if you're interested in more about AFAR region's challenges in monitoring and maintenance, and especially like these different digital tools can really be used in different projects, I'd recommend checking those out. So with that, I think we have like some time for Q&A. There's quite, I don't think we need to share slides anymore. So let's just see if we can have a discussion and let me know what you all would like to know more about.
Hey, Anna, I'd like to know more about the machine learning and how that was an intervention with the remote sensing.
Yeah, thanks, Patrick. So the machine learning hasn't been applied to the sensors as like, it hasn't been rolled out in the latest firmware updates, but SweetSense has been testing, the traditional expert status classification system that's currently in use, how the sensors interpret borehole runtime against the machine learning one. And the machine learning one is definitely more accurate. The numbers I presented are the ones that were applied in AFAR, which was the traditional system. So machine learning definitely has a lot to offer. The problem is when it was originally suggested several years ago as like, we should just do 100% machine learning. People in AFAR understandably were not always on board with something that seemed like kind of like a black box. There were a lot of difficulties in explaining how the sensors worked. Versus now we have this like clear flow chart. It's in the sensor paper of like how the sensors take in data and how they interpret that to classify into the suggested borehole status. And they're not like that far apart. The 80% accuracy is like 90% for machine learning. So it's not perfect either.
Can I ask a question? to Brett and Anna. I guess with the findings, it's a really rich finding of something that didn't work perfectly, if that's a fair reflection. And I think that's really super useful learning. And so I guess coming from now, I'm not wearing a consult hat, I'm wearing a United Purpose hat, which is looking at kind of doing maintenance services at scale and the kind of potential of smart sensors within a kind of system-wide approach, etc. Be really good to hear from you, like, if you were to design it differently, what would you change now, knowing what you know now? I know that's a really kind of rubbish, generic question, but I think in this context, it would be really interesting to hear your findings.
Yeah, I mean, I'll try to be brief because it is a challenging question. And I think the thing is, we talk about like a lot of different things we do differently, but sometimes we're like, would that even have worked? So I don't want to put any pin in it that we actually know. And we'll share, we also have another final action research paper that'll be on the IRC website that has a lot of kind of discussion in it as well. That might be a good resource to look out for. But I think from my experience, it's really understanding the output of the data. I think this project was sort of like, if you have data, it will be used. And that just wasn't the case. There was so much data and so many processes to collect that data. And it was, some was supposed to be used for maintenance and some was supposed to be used for like updating kind of daily stuff or long-term planning. And it was too much, So I would sort of like try to have an MVP in some ways of like, what is the simplest way of getting data in the system? And the most viable use case of data initially, and then kind of build up from there. This was just such a big, complex system. I think we never really got all the pieces working, and the data really was never there to make decisions because it wasn't, working completely. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's a big question, but certainly we did learn a lot.
Hi, this is Frank Graves. Thank you. Can I just ask a quick question? I know a couple of you there. Hi, Will, Brett, and thank you very much. So in Turpin, we're setting up a remote sensing maintenance project in South Sudan, in Northern Bahr el Ghazal. It really isn't about the use of the smart data itself. It's more around the structure that will make use of this data. And what we're finding is that, and I'm almost in some ways can understand and not fully surprised of your results in one way, because what we've seen is that even before installing our sensors in 40 hand pumps at the moment, we've seen that most of the hand pumps weren't working to begin with. So the question is, it's in a sense, it's the value added rather than, is it, how much do the sensors bring in terms of increased uptime? What was the situation to begin with? And crucially, one of the questions we found is, what's the spare part supply system like anyway? Because if you've got a sort of partly functioning, non-perfectly functioning hand pump on which you install the sensors to begin with, and there is no spare part supply chain, you're not going to get a reading which says how much benefit fully smart data can bring to the situation. So I just wonder what were you what did you do about baseline, or what would you do about this baseline situation, getting a sort of minimum level of functionality even before you put the sensors on? Was that an issue? Was that a sort of process you went through, or would you endorse that next time?
I would say this sounds a little more similar to what Fundifix has done in Kenya than what was tried in Afar. In Afar, they're really large borehole systems. These are generators, these are pumps and tanks. And so functionality, actually, because of the size of the system, was actually higher than expected. It was around 80% to start with. And we just didn't really see very much change in that over the course of the project. There's seasonal use changes, of course, that really affect functionality and like what's prioritized for repairs. But overall, like functionality in Afar, like slight decline over the years, but not very much, as they've tried to increase coverage. And then we also found that, I mean, the sensor data, again, it was just doing the rehabilitation while they were installing the sensor data was like such a kind of a bias in determining the effect of what the actual monitoring system was. That was really hard to parse that out. And then also I would mention that we didn't have a formal repair service, like a professionalized maintenance service operating in Afar either. If you heard from Lamisa, the country director of IRC, in one of the other sessions, he talked about like the national policy for Ethiopian water supply and how they've made progress towards like supporting policy for professionalized maintenance, but we're definitely not there yet. And this was all about enabling the existing government actors, the regional O&M team, to kind of do their job a bit better with some additional tools, but without actually investing into like the size of the capacity of that team. So giving them tools, but not trucks, not physical tools or anything like that. So yeah, that was definitely a challenge.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you. Good, interesting. Thank you.
Great. And I did see Will asked for a resource, a document that was on broader review of application of sensors. Was that the journal article, or is another resource you could link to?
No, that's not that journal article, but there's definitely some others. There's definitely a World Bank report that I'm thinking of that's all about like sensors for rural water supply, but it's a few years out of date. I think Luis Andres wrote that one.
Or actually, Martin, I'm seeing it would be interesting to ensure the digital data is maximum put to use. Do you want to come off mute and speak to that a little bit more, Martin?
Let me try, because I'm using my I'm using my
I can hear you
phone.
pretty well.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I was just saying that the system, the digital system is good, and but how do we use the results from it to engage like service providers, maybe also for advocacy or for quick implementation of activities like maybe maintenance or engaging communities? Thank you.
Yeah, I think the challenge that we faced, we didn't quite get there because we weren't seeing enough rapid updating of the system, so the data wasn't immediately useful. So, you know, really trying to understand what data output you want to make decisions and focusing on that to make sure that that data is being put into the system as soon and as rapidly as possible, kept up to date, and then, you know, utilized. So we were just seeing that like we'd implement a change to the system. You know, we were expecting data to come in and to be able to be utilized, but without that data actually coming into the system, you know, in 6 months, any data that was there was out of date. And we weren't really able to see much use. So it doesn't quite answer your question on exactly how to utilize the data, but, you know, from our experience, you know, focusing on what data you can use, and really getting that data in the system in the simplest way possible is really important, rather than having a million data points that captures everything that everybody wants, but is really impossible or challenging to actually utilize or update.
Yeah, I would say there was also a lot of national policy work around this too, because there were just really unclear instructions from the national government about what regions should be reporting on. So for example, there's like the One Wash national program in Ethiopia, and they had all these target indicators and things that the regional water bureaus are supposed to report on, but that doesn't cover everything they do. And so the things that were not part of the program, like it was really unclear what key performance indicators the management really wanted. And so as a result, like using the sensor data, we kind of came up with some of our own, like we were like, okay, we can report all these different indicators. We don't really know what you need to do your planning long term. And so it was like just kind of a lot of miscommunication over there over time about getting management on board enough to specify exactly what the system needed them to, what they needed to know from it.
Great. Well, I do see we have Martin and Eliza who are on the SWS project, and Steph, who I know is an EI employee. So hi, Steph. Since we have this small intimate group, I mean, maybe Steph, do you have any questions or kind of comments for Anna and Brett, as well as Eliza also? If either of you have questions, we have time for probably one or two more questions, and then I'll wrap things up.
I guess my only question was at the end there, you talked about some of the difficulties in funding maintenance, I think, for the pumps, and if there have been any plans or thoughts or developments on where to get the funding for keeping those monitoring systems more like a higher percentage of functionality.
Yeah, so IRC is working with the national government to develop some funding strategies and some maintenance strategies, and they've also worked with the lower level governments on some master planning and some financing strategies for that. We did see the region take on some of the costs, and some of the costs will continue to be shared through other funding sources outside of SWS. Yeah, but generally, that's still in the works. Anna, I don't know if you can add more.
Yeah, I would just add that the data services, since Lowland Wash ended, those have been covered by NASA under the SEVERE program. And it's really, that program is about building out a drought management platform for all of East Africa. That's kind of comparable to FuseNet. So it's supposed to provide drought early warnings. And so the sensors are part of hundreds of other sensors in other places too that are supposed to be contributing data towards this big drought management model. So there are donors out there who definitely see the value of sustaining what's already there. I mean, we spent all this money and time deploying sensors. It would be a waste to kind of just let them break down over time. So hopefully they're going to be continued to be repaired and sustained.
Great, thank you. So I do recognize we're at the hour. So for those that need to drop off, thank you so much for joining us. I did put a link in the chat to a post-event survey. We'd really appreciate it if you could take just 3 to 5 minutes to fill it out, just so we can have some of your feedback on your experience over the last 2 weeks. And for those who are interested to stay on, there is another question in the chat on whether there's a discrepancy between data collected using these systems or tools and other government service provider tools. I believe that question's also from Martin.
Yeah, so the government is basically completely paper-based in its data collection and reporting, and it's very incomplete. I mean, everyone sort of understands that what the regions or the wards are reporting up is made up, or half collected at best. And so, people are the concern that we find from government is if we choose X tool, which we chose ImWater, you know, how will we continue to utilize that in the future if the national government decides something else, or if some other NGO comes in and says they want to use a different tool. And so with ImWater, you can take the data, but, you know, rebuilding the tool or having another tool come in is certainly something that people are concerned about or interested in sort of understanding how they would navigate that in the future. But there's a huge push for data, but exactly what that data needs to be, what it's supposed to inform, who it's supposed to be reported to, both up and down the chain, and exactly how it's supposed to be collected and using what tool is sort of all of these kind of uncertain questions that we got pretty far into, you know, utilizing ImWater and learned a lot about that. But there's a lot of kind of questions around data in Ethiopia generally about what's the best approach. And I think hopefully our learning can contribute to that change in the future.
Yeah, and just that no asset inventory, no data collection process is ever going to be perfect. There's always going to be errors, numerator error, GPS error, signal error, anything. And not having a plan to address that during collection, like having a data cleaning plan and a data management plan long-term with like an IT department that's staffed and ready to support that process, is definitely a recipe for challenges and struggle in that regard. So that's something that everybody faces, I think.
Great. And I'm seeing a question from Eliza in the chat. In terms of dispatching maintenance services, if there were adequate O&M resources available, how do you think the effectiveness of sensors would compare to call-in numbers for people to report breakdowns?
Well, we can point to some previous studies that have looked at this with hand pumps specifically. There was a project in like 2015 with Living Water International in Rwanda that tested like a circuit wider program with sensors on hand pumps. If you know Evan Thomas, which I think you do, then he's probably talked about it to you, where they did prove like effectiveness of, you know, just shortening that communication time from knowing when and where the breakdowns were, when there was a fully staffed maintenance service ready to go, basically. And that's not really what we had in Afar, so we of course didn't see the same results.
And I think one other thing that we saw is that, you know, really figuring out what the best approach to using sensors is something that maybe needs to be thought more about or really discussed in the design phase. You know, we saw, like you're saying, is that very high important schemes are going to get a phone call regardless if there's a sensor or not, if it's the essential water source. So a sensor in that context might not be that great. But then in some of the more rural areas, we saw that, you know, these systems didn't pump but once a month or even less, or they were very seasonal in their use. And that made utilizing a sensor there really challenging. Yeah, really understanding sort of what the sensors are meant to accomplish instead of just a vast kind of blanket rollout may be more effective.
Great, thank you, Anna and Brett. I'm not seeing any additional questions in the chat, and we are now 5 minutes over, so I think we can probably close this session. But again, I just want to thank everyone for joining us over the past 2 weeks. I hope you really enjoyed learning and reflecting with us on these topics. Please do fill out the post-event survey that I shared the link in the chat. And yeah, have a great rest of your day, and we look forward to continuing to engage with you beyond in the next few months and beyond SWS. So thanks, everyone.